Welcome to the Planetary Republic of Comics, Module 3, Comics and Politics. I am Professor Frederick Luis Aldama here at The Ohio State University. As a cultural object made by creators living in time and place, the making, distributing, and consuming of comic books across the globe is shaped within various and varied social and political contexts. To at least briefly trace this landscape, in this module, we will attend to issues that pertain to the socio-political context of creation and distribution in different historical epochs and geographic regions. We will also consider how such contexts inflect matters of form and content that are either working within or against the officially sanctioned and politically authorized status quo. When it comes to comic book creation and distribution, there's an assumption that democratic nations such as the US and Europe allow for a total anarchy in art, a total freedom of expression. Usually, this assumption is built out of a sense that non-democratic regions of the globe, such as the Middle East, Cuba, North Korea, and countries in Central and South America, actively curtail the freedom of expression. While certainly comic book creators in the US and Europe have been more successful in creating all variety of comics, this has by no means been a guarantee. Along with other artists, there has been a long history of struggle to combat repressive policies that threaten to straitjacket the form and contents of comics. The US has experienced its fair share of draconian repressive measures on the arts. This was most notably seen in 1954 when psychiatrist Frederick Wortham published his Seduction of the Innocent. For Wortham, the reading of comics by the country's innocent young people would grow a nation of criminals, drug addicts, and queers. His book launched a congressional investigation into the comic book industry that led to the establishing of the Comics Code Authority. For the foreseeable future, the Comic Code Authority would determine what was suitable for mainstream publishers to print. Fearful of lawsuits and even prison terms, publishers imposed self-censorship codes as prescribed by the Comics Code. The comics published after 1954 were hugely toned down in their depiction of violence, nudity, and sexual innuendo. As a result, comic books like the horror, fantasy, and war comics of EC lost their edge and attitude. The comic book industry was quickly reduced to a sophomoric, infantile state, populated with silly superheroes, bland romances and adventures, and furry animals. With fewer comics being published with a drop from 650 to 250 titles between 1954 and 1956, along with the huge loss of readers, hundreds of comic book creators lost their jobs. Before and during the onset of this period of censorship, some creators had figured out how to get around censorship mechanisms. For instance, the publisher William Gaines and editor Harvey Kurtzman created the anti-authoritarian and wildly satirical Mad magazine. Established as a magazine, Gaines and Kurtzman were able to sidestep the restrictive regulations of the code, offering a breath of fresh air to readers in a comic book world with the air sucked out of it. The Comics Code's restrictions and the culture of fear and anxiety that it existed within were eventually ruptured with the arrival of the underground comic scene in the late 60s. While these were comics created at the edge of society, as its momentum built and visibility increased, it too became the object of surveillance. For instance, in 1969, Peter Dargis, owner of East Side Bookshop, and Charles Kirkpatrick, owner of New Yorker Bookshop, were arrested for distributing so-called obscene materials. They were selling Zap issue 4. While many testified in behalf of the aesthetics of comics on October 28, 1970, Judge Joel Taylor of the Deep Throat censorship frame declared Zap issue 4 legally obscene. He declared Dargis and Kirkpatrick guilty. In 1973, further sets of repression were put into place when the Supreme Court passed the law that local communities could establish their own obscenity standards. Out of fear of prosecution, This led to the closing down of many of the venues, especially so-called head shops that sold bongs and countercultural magazines, clothes, and the like, where underground comics were sold. Such repressive measures continued into the 1980s. Famously, Michael Cora of Friendly Frank's comic shop was arrested on charges of distributing obscenity for selling Reed Waller's anthropomorphic erotica comic, Omaha, the Cat Dancer. Richard Corbin's and Simon Revelstoke's high-octane fantasy adventure tale that featured bare-bosomed maidens, the Bodyssey, and Robert Crumb's comics anthology Weirdo. Indeed, it was the absurdity of this case that posed a serious threat to the freedom of expression and civil liberties that led to Dennis Kitcher to establish the nonprofit Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. Funded by comic book creators, the CBLDF is devoted to defend the freedom of expression, distribution, and consumption of comics. By the late 1980s, many comics with explicit reference to sex, LGBTQ characterizations, and those that depicted extreme violence began to fly under the Comics Code radar. With the likes of DC establishing the age-restricted adult-oriented imprint Vertigo and others following suit, publishers were increasingly able to get around the Comics Code rulebook. This said, the power of the conservative thread that makes up part of U.S. social fabric has continued to affect the making and consuming of comics. For instance, in 2000, the store clerk Jesus Castillo of Keith's Comics in Dallas, Texas, was arrested and found guilty for selling hentai manga. Because the mature audience manga was in a comic book store, it was claimed that he was selling pornography to children. He was sentenced to 180 days in jail, 1 year of probation, and given a $4,000 fine, a decision that was upheld in spite of requests that the conviction be overturned. And there continue to be cases where conservative individuals or groups pressure libraries to ban certain comics. In Marshall, Missouri, it was demanded that the public library not carry Craig Thompson's Blankets, an autobiographical comic that tells of his journey away from and rejection of his family's evangelical Christian beliefs. And in South Carolina, the state legislature debated cutting $52,000 from the College of Charleston's budget if it incorporated Fun Home into its College Reads program for incoming freshmen. The cut would have wiped out its College Reads program altogether. In Europe, there have been similar moments of despotic repression. For instance, at one point in Britain, the British Communist Party and the Church of England rallied together conservative teachers and parents to pressure the government to ban comics that portrayed violence. The claim, reading these comics leads to criminal behavior and hooliganism. In 1955, the Children and Young Persons Act was established, and it's still active today. The entity had a field day with Britain's own underground comic scene. By the late 1960s and early 70s, it had already found publishers of Nasty Tales and Oz guilty for distributing obscenity. Those publishers of Oz were sentenced to prison, and in what became one of the longest obscenity trials in British legal history, the verdict was finally overturned by appeal. In this schematic history of the repression of comics, there have always been policies and ideological mechanisms put into play aimed to restrict the movement of comics between countries. In addition to the official comics codes that came to exist in Europe, there was the belief that comics, as the embodiment of U.S. American culture, was crass, that it was the lowest of the lowbrow of culture. In France, the long tradition of bande dessinée being published in book format and sold in bookstores lent it a certain cultural credibility among the serious-minded adults. The publishing and distribution of and more content inspired by U.S. mainstream comic books was considered to be less serious and, in some highbrow circles, an imperialist sullying of highbrow Francophone culture. In other countries, the gatekeeping of comics from other countries has even appeared in the making of policies. There were especially restrictive measures placed on comic book authors in Mexico and throughout South America. For instance, in 1944, the Catholic Legion of Decency in Mexico led to the censorship and even jail time for creators. For instance, in 1953, Adolfo Mariño was arrested and sentenced to jail for creating his comics Yolanda and Picante. In Asia, in 1945, we see an even more dramatic move to hold at bay the comics of another country when South Korea established the law for punishing anti-national deeds. While not directed at Japan, it effectively created an embargo on Japanese manga. With Japan having occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945 and even used manga format as a tool of colonial propaganda, the embargo safeguarded the growth of a South Korean comic book manhwa marketplace. Other countries implemented policies to create an insular propagandistic comic scene. For instance, with the creation of the People's Republic of China in 1949, the long tradition of pocket-sized comics were used as part of the Mao-era Cultural Revolution propaganda machine. Distributed by the People's Art Institute of Shanghai, millions of volumes were printed each year. Transforming the Lianhuanhua tradition of telling realistic stories about historical events and everyday life in the hands of the People's Art Institute. They were used to educate readers and to indoctrinate them in revolutionary ways. If a comic deviated from the Maoist doctrine, it was destroyed. Comics have been a space of resistance to authoritarian nation-state practices. The underground comics movement that took place in the US and Europe in the late 60s and early 70s famously pushed against all of the repressive censorship measures that I mentioned earlier. In the US, those like Crumb, Spain, Rodriguez, Gilbert Shelton, S. Clay Wilson, along with many others, resisted the Comics Code's rules and regulations. They did so in their deliberate choice to celebrate in exaggerated ways all things countercultural, especially having to do with drugs and sex. Across the pond in Europe, we also see an explosion of anti-establishment comics during the epochs of the 60s and 70s. In Italy, there arrived the fumetti neri, or the black comics, characterized by anti-heroic, erotic, affirming narratives. And there was also the fumetti dottore that relished in and affirmed the body, all while leveling pointed critiques at Italy's socio-political scene. In France, there was the rise of a counter-cultural comic book scene that grew up around comic magazines like Pilote and Charlie Hebdo. In Spain, after the death of Franco in 1975, creators moved from safe juvenile tabeos to create more satirical, sexually adventurous, and politically rebellious works. In Germany, the lead up to and after the fall of the Berlin Wall in '89 witnessed the rise of many new, younger generation comic book creators seeking to use an expressive, exploratory visual style in their work, often including graffiti, mural, and poster art, as well as modern influences. The magazine Strapazen became an important venue for these creators. During this period in Britain, one witnessed several notable alternative publishing venues in comics. They include the psychedelic-inspired magazine Oz and Cyclops that reprinted comics by Spain Rodriguez, Von Baudet, and Gilbert Shelton, as well as Raymond Lowry, Edward Barker, David Jarrett. Nasty Tales that also published Brits like Chris Welch and Edward Barker, as well as reprinted U.S. underground comics. In 1975, there appeared the adult fantasy Brainstorm Comics that ran for 3 years and featured the likes of Brian Talbot with his 65-page drug-fueled Chester P. Hackenbush, The Psychedelic Alchemist. As the US and European underground comic scene became harder and harder to sustain, there was the transition into alternative comics. We see this with the arrival of creators like Art Spiegelman, Françoise Mouly, Bill Griffiths, and others arriving on the scene who sought a less in-your-face way of fighting for creative freedom. The 1980 publication of the high-production, full-color, and black-and-white formatted Raw, known for serializing Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning Mouse, marks this transition and published U.S., European, South American, Japanese, and African comic book creators that sought to bring a subtle and literary approach to their comic storytelling. Comic book creators from all over the globe have created within many different socio-political contexts. However, in spite of the ebbs and flows of various gatekeeping strategies, taken as a whole and seen within a larger window of history, such creators and their creations ultimately make up a healthy, rapidly growing planetary republic of comics today.